When you're building up your Playwright end-to-end test suite, a short test execution time should be one of your primary goals, because nobody wants to wait 10, 15, 20 minutes for all these tests to pass, right? And this is why when you create a new project using npm init playwright latest, the generated playwright config includes the fully parallel option being set to true. Let's look at an example to understand what fully parallel actually does. This project includes two spec files. One is called sequential spec.ts, the other one is called parallel spec.ts, and they're both including two tests. They're basically the same spec files. And these tests then log out when they start, then there's an artificial delay, and then they will log out when this test is done. When we now head to the terminal and we run these tests with npx playwright test, we will see that Playwright is doing its best to parallelize as much as possible. So it's using here now 4 workers, and we see that all 4 test cases are kicked off at the same time, and because they have the same delay, they are also finishing at the same time. But what should you do when you don't want to run all your tests in parallel? One option is to go back to your Playwright config and disable the fully parallel option. Let's see what happens now. When we go back to the terminal and rerun our tests again, we see that the 2 spec files are running in parallel, but the tests included in these spec files are running sequentially. And this is Playwright's default behavior. If we don't enable fully parallel or configure our spec files or limit the number of worker processes, Playwright will try to parallelize the spec files, but run the tests included in these spec files sequentially. But to make your test suite run as quickly as possible, it is a good habit to turn on fully parallel. And while the idea is great to really run all the test cases independently and at all times, there are some scenarios when this just doesn't work. For example, let's assume you have 10 test cases that are all using the same user account, so that they're conflicting with each other when they run in parallel. So in these scenarios, you must opt into sequential test execution. So we can now go into our sequential spec.ts and we can add a configure block. So we can say for this spec file here, we want to configure that the execution mode should be serial. And I actually covered this and the topic of worker processes in another video, so if you want to learn more, check this one out. But the funny thing about this video is that it had a comment with a question that I didn't have the answer for until now. Someone pointed out that when you run your Playwright project in fully parallel mode and you use the execution mode serial, that the execution of the tests will stop once one test will fail. Let's see this behavior in action. When we go back to our terminal and we now run npx playwright test, we will see that the files defined in parallel spec are indeed run in parallel because of the fully parallel option, but the sequential specs, the one that we just turned on the serial mode for, are run sequentially. Let's break the first test case on purpose and add an error here. When we now run our sequential tests, again with npx playwright tests, we will discover that running tests in serial mode doesn't only mean to run them sequentially, but also it leads to the fact that if there is an error, all the following tests won't be executed. So in our case here, we see that sequential spec 1 was kicked off, it threw an error, made the test case fail, and then sequential 2 wasn't run. And even though this behavior surprised me a couple of times, it's clearly documented in the Playwright docs. If you're running your tests in serial mode, subsequent tests will be skipped in case of a failure. But what if I really want to execute all the tests but run them sequentially? I could now set up different Playwright projects and maybe run them only with a single worker or define some globbing patterns, but I just discovered another solution. I'm here in the Playwright issue tracker on GitHub, and Yuri, who works for Microsoft, shared a third execution mode that you can define in your spec files. So the default mode doesn't prevent the execution of subsequent tests in case there's an error, and they only will run in a single worker process. So they won't run in parallel like at all. Let's give it a try. When we go back into our sequential spec.ts file, there is indeed a default mode. So when we now run our test cases again, we will find out that there's still this failure, but still sequential 2 spec will be run. So right now we only have one failed test case, doesn't matter if it was sequentially or in parallel, and all tests were executed. When we now check the docs for test describe configure, the default mode is mentioned here in the mode arguments, but it looks like the main use case is a different one. The example here shows that you can use the default mode to run 2 describe blocks in parallel, but the tests inside of these describe blocks in sequence. Let's give it a try too. When we now go into our Parallel spec.ts file, that was just the example that I showed you in the beginning, we can remove everything and we can place an example that is similar to the one that we've just seen in the Playwright docs. We have here 2 test groups, so one group 1 and one group 2, and both define different test cases. And inside of these describe blocks, we define that we want to have the test execution mode to be default. So when we now run this, these 2 groups here, so group 1 and group 2, should run in parallel, but the tests inside of the group should run in sequence. Let's see if this works. So let's go back to the terminal and call npx playwright test, but I only now want to run the Parallel spec.ts file so that we don't have so much noise in the terminal. So let's run tests Parallel spec.ts and let's see what happens. So we have 4 tests. And this seems to work correctly. So these 2 were run in parallel. And then after each test finished, the next test in order of this particular group was run. Let's add some errors to see if we're still running all the tests. So I'm adding an error here and I'm adding an error here. So the expectation now is that we're still running all 4 tests in this order that we have seen here right now. So let's see what happens. Here we go. So we have now the errors, but we are still running all the tests. Sweet. And to drive things home, let's change our default mode now back to serial for our groups that run in parallel. So when we now go in here and we say that we want to have serial mode, we expect that these 2 groups run in parallel, but they will stop executing subsequent tests when there was a failure. So let's run this. Here we go. And here we have it. So we have 2 failed test cases, 2 didn't run, and these 2 here were run in parallel. That's super nice. So when you want to run your tests one after another, you can either reach for the serial mode, which will stop if there is a test error or failure. And if you want to really run all the test cases, but sequentially, you can then reach for the default mode. But keep in mind, ideally, you want to run your tests as much as possible in parallel and have them work independently. But sometimes it is how it is. If you have any comments or questions or feedback, make sure to drop it below. You've seen I like to answer questions that I find in the YouTube comments. And if you're testing your sites and apps with Playwright, you might want to check out Checkly, because with Checkly, you can take your existing Playwright codebase and run it from around the globe on a schedule for production monitoring. It's honestly pretty sweet. And now I'm done, and I will see you in the next Playwright Tips video.